This outline examines a style of religious motivational messaging commonly framed around the identity of the chosen one, a format that has become increasingly visible across online sermons, prophetic videos, and spiritual encouragement content. These messages are often emotionally powerful and rhetorically sophisticated, designed to resonate with people who feel exhausted, isolated, uncertain, or worn down by prolonged struggle. They speak directly to listeners in the second person, collapsing distance and creating a sense of intimacy and immediacy that feels personal rather than abstract. For many people, this resonance is real. It arises not because the listener is naive or uncritical, but because the language addresses genuine human experiences, feeling unseen, misunderstood, delayed, or left behind. Longing for meaning that redeems pain, wanting assurance that endurance has not been wasted. The emotional impact of these messages should not be dismissed or mocked. They often provide temporary relief, coherence, and hope in moments where life feels fragmented or overwhelming. At the same time, emotional resonance alone is not a sufficient measure of truth accuracy or long-term benefit. This outline does not exist to shame belief, invalidate faith, or deny the possibility of spiritual meaning in people's lives. It is also not a counter-revelation, a debunking manifesto, or an attempt to replace one belief system with another. It does not argue that faith itself is harmful, nor that religious language is inherently manipulative. Instead, it offers an interpretive analysis of how a specific style of messaging functions, how meaning is constructed through language, how authority is subtly transferred from the listener to the speaker or source, how emotional engagement is sustained over time, and what psychological pressures are quietly introduced alongside comfort and reassurance. Many chosen one messages rely on broad, symbolic, emotionally charged language that allows listeners to project their own experiences into the narrative. Phrases such as "this moment is not random," "you have always been different," or "this found you at the exact right time" are not verifiable claims, but they feel precise because they invite autobiographical interpretation. Nearly anyone who has experienced hardship sensitivity or a sense of being out of step with their environment can recognize themselves in these descriptions. Feeling seen in this context is a normal psychological response to attuned, affirming language, not evidence of divine selection or hidden identity. This outline aims to slow down that interpretive leap, not by ridiculing it, but by examining how it occurs. Another core feature of this messaging style is the reframing of pain as proof of destiny. Struggle, delay, isolation, and exhaustion are presented as evidence of preparation, rather than as conditions that may require rest, support, skill building, or contextual change. This reframing can be deeply soothing in the short term because it assigns purpose to suffering and reduces uncertainty. However, it also carries a cost when pain is equated with purpose. Relief can begin to feel like regression, and stability can feel undeserved or premature. The listener may unconsciously learn to tolerate or even preserve distress because it has been given meaning. This analysis does not claim that suffering is meaningless, nor does it deny that people often grow through hardship. It simply questions the assumption that pain must always be spiritualized, elevated, or retroactively justified in order to be bearable. A further element examined here is the use of urgency. Language that emphasizes now, this moment, the season is shifting, or what comes next activates the nervous system and narrows attention. Urgency keeps listeners emotionally engaged, reduces reflective distance, and encourages repeated consumption of the message source. Importantly, this urgency is often framed as loving guidance rather than threat, which makes it harder to recognize. Over time, living in a state of constant anticipation can be physiologically and psychologically draining. This outline does not suggest that urgency is always manipulative, but it does ask what happens when rest, neutrality, and ordinary human rhythms are subtly devalued in favor of perpetual readiness. Authority is another central theme. By invoking God, heaven, ancient councils, prophetic destiny, or pre-written blueprints, these messages often shift interpretive authority away from the listener's lived judgment. Meaning flows downward from the message to the individual, rather than emerging through reflection, feedback, and lived experience. Calls to like, subscribe, comment, or give financially are sometimes framed as spiritual agreement or covenant reinforcing belonging through compliance. This creates validation loops that reward emotional responsiveness and public alignment rather than autonomy or discernment. Again, this outline does not accuse every speaker of bad intent. It simply examines the structural effects of these patterns when repeated over time. Throughout this analysis, safety is a central priority. Nothing here requires belief rejection, action, confession, identity change, or allegiance. The listener is not late, not early, not missing anything, and not failing a test. This is not an activation, a calling, a warning, or an assignment. It does not ask the reader to adopt a new framework or abandon an old one. Its sole purpose is interpretive correction to slow perception, reduce unnecessary pressure, and restore psychological and nervous system stability. By naming how meaning is being constructed and what it costs over time, the outline aims to return interpretive authority to the listener's own judgment and lived experience. Sustainable growth, whether spiritual or psychological, is rarely dramatic. It is quieter, less identity-driven, and more compatible with rest, ordinariness, and uncertainty. This introduction sets the tone for the sections that follow: clarity over excitement, understanding over activation, and grounded awareness over heightened alertness. The message opens by asserting non-randomness with phrases such as "this moment is not coincidence, you were led here," or "this found you at the exact right time," and this move is foundational to how the entire structure operates. By declaring non-randomness at the outset, the message bypasses the listener's ability to approach the content neutrally. There is no invitation to consider, evaluate, or observe from a distance. Instead, the listener is immediately placed inside the narrative. The framing does not ask whether the message applies. It assumes application as a given. This is powerful because it requires no evidence, no specificity, and no verification. The claim cannot be disproven because it refers not to an external fact, but to an internal interpretation of timing. If the listener feels any emotional resonance, curiosity, or attentiveness, that reaction itself can be retroactively used as confirmation that the framing was true. In this way, the message creates a closed loop where response becomes proof. By insisting that the listener was divinely guided to this exact moment, the speaker collapses the psychological distance between themselves and the audience. The content is no longer something being offered, it is something being delivered. The speaker is no longer a person sharing an idea, they are positioned as a conduit. This removes the ordinary social contract of communication where both parties retain agency. Instead, listening is reframed as participation in an already unfolding process. The listener is subtly told that they are not choosing to listen, they are responding to guidance. This shift matters because it changes the meaning of doubt. In a neutral context, doubt is simply a cognitive response, a pause, a question, or a boundary. In this framed context, doubt becomes resistance. Hesitation is no longer about discernment. It is reinterpreted as fear, delay, or lack of alignment. The listener is placed in a position where agreement feels like openness, and disagreement feels like closing oneself off from something important. This dynamic does not rely on explicit threat. There is no need to warn of punishment or loss. The pressure operates through implication. If this moment is divinely arranged, then disengaging carries an unspoken cost, missing what was meant for you. That cost is never clearly defined, which makes it more effective. The mind fills in the gap with personal fears, wasted potential, delayed destiny, spiritual stagnation, or repeating past mistakes. Because the message asserts involvement before consent is given, the listener's autonomy is subtly overridden at the very beginning. There is no moment where the listener is asked, "Would you like to engage with this?" Instead, the message says, "You are already engaged, and this engagement means something about you." This is especially potent for people who already feel uncertain behind or afraid of missing something important in life. For someone in that state, the idea that this moment is not random can feel relieving. It reduces ambiguity and replaces it with meaning. Confusion is softened by the sense that at least something is ordered, intentional, and guided. However, that relief comes at a psychological cost. Once non-randomness is asserted, neutrality disappears. The listener is no longer free to treat the message as one input among many. It becomes marked as special, elevated above ordinary information. This elevation does not come from demonstrated insight or practical usefulness, but from framing alone. The message does not need to be accurate to feel important. It only needs to feel timely. Timeliness in this context is not about relevance to concrete circumstances, but about emotional readiness. Anyone who is tired, searching, or reflective can feel that now is significant. The framing exploits a universal human tendency. When we are already in a state of heightened meaning-seeking, we are more likely to interpret coincidence as signal. The assertion of non-randomness takes advantage of this state and formalizes it into a claim of guidance. Importantly, the listener is not given tools to evaluate that claim. There is no criteria offered for distinguishing guided timing from ordinary exposure. The algorithm, the platform the speakers reach, and the listener's own browsing behavior disappear from view. All contextual explanations are replaced with a singular transcendent one. This narrowing of explanations simplifies the world, which can feel comforting, but it also reduces cognitive flexibility. Over time, repeated exposure to this framing can train the listener to experience everyday encounters through a heightened lens of significance where ordinary chance is no longer tolerated. Everything must mean something. This increases cognitive and emotional load because meaning-making becomes constant and urgent rather than optional and reflective. Another effect of this opening move is the rapid creation of intimacy. By telling the listener that this message was meant specifically for them, the speaker establishes a one-sided closeness that feels personal but does not require mutual relationship. The listener may feel understood without actually being known. This can be soothing, especially for those who feel unseen in their daily lives. However, it also makes the listener more vulnerable to influence because intimacy lowers defenses. When someone feels personally addressed, they are less likely to question motives or structure. The message does not need to earn trust through consistency or accountability. Trust is granted through perceived destiny. This is why the assertion of non-randomness is not a neutral rhetorical flourish. It is a strategic repositioning of the listener's role. They are no longer an observer. They are a participant in a story that has already begun. The story's premise is accepted before its content is examined. Once that premise is accepted, everything that follows is interpreted through it. Encouragement feels prophetic. Suggestions feel directive. Calls to action feel necessary. Even emotional reactions are framed as confirmation. If the listener feels moved, it proves the message was meant for them. If they feel uncomfortable, it can be framed as conviction stretching or resistance to growth. There is no emotional response that invalidates the frame. Every response is absorbed into it. This makes the opening assertion incredibly powerful and difficult to disengage from once accepted. It is also why this analysis focuses so carefully on it. The goal here is not to tell the listener that the moment is random, meaningless, or empty. It is to restore the possibility that meaning does not have to be pre-assigned in order to exist. A message can be interesting without being destined. A moment can be reflective without being orchestrated. Engagement can be chosen without being spiritually mandated. By slowing down this initial framing and examining how it functions, interpretive authority is gently returned to the listener. They are allowed again to decide what this moment means, rather than having that meaning declared on their behalf. The claim that the word carries weight functions as a powerful signaling device long before any concrete meaning is delivered. It announces seriousness without explanation and consequence without clarity. Nothing specific has yet been said, but the listener is already instructed on how to feel about what is coming. The phrase does not describe content, it describes importance. This distinction matters because importance can be asserted instantly, while content would require demonstration, coherence, or evidence. By declaring weight up front, the message preloads the listener's interpretation. Whatever follows will be filtered through the assumption that it is heavy, significant, and consequential, even if the ideas themselves are familiar, vague, or repetitive. This framing operates through implication rather than threat. There is no explicit warning, no statement of danger, no promise of punishment. Instead, the urgency is ambient. Something important is happening now, and the listener is implicitly responsible for not missing it. This form of urgency is especially effective because it feels gentle and caring rather than coercive. It does not say listen or else. It says stay because this matters. The nervous system responds to this cue automatically. When importance without clarity is signaled, attention sharpens. The body shifts into a state of alert receptivity. Heart rate may increase slightly, muscles subtly tense, and cognitive focus narrows. This is not panic, it is readiness. The listener becomes more attentive, more emotionally open, and more willing to suspend skepticism in order to receive what has been framed as significant. In this state, critical evaluation is not eliminated, but it is deprioritized. The mind's primary task becomes not assessment, but absorption. The phrase "this word carries weight" also creates asymmetry between speaker and listener. Weight implies authority. It suggests that the speaker is carrying something substantial on behalf of the listener, something the listener does not yet possess. This positions the speaker as a mediator of importance rather than a peer-sharing perspective. The listener is subtly cast as a recipient who must be careful, respectful, and attentive. Disengagement begins to feel inappropriate, even disrespectful, because one does not casually dismiss something described as weighty. The lack of specificity further intensifies this dynamic. Because the content has not yet been defined, the listener's imagination fills the gap. The mind begins to anticipate revelation, correction, or transformation. This anticipation itself becomes a form of engagement. The listener is no longer passively hearing words, they are actively waiting for meaning to land. This waiting state is emotionally charged and self-reinforcing. The longer the message sustains the sense of weight without resolution, the more invested the listener becomes because attention has already been spent. Walking away would mean abandoning something that has been framed as important but not yet received. This is where urgency enters through implication rather than threat. The listener is not told that something bad will happen if they leave. Instead, they are led to feel that something meaningful will not happen. The cost is framed as loss of potential rather than punishment. This is psychologically potent because humans are generally more motivated to avoid loss than to pursue gain. The undefined nature of the loss makes it even more compelling because the mind can personalize it. For one listener, the missed thing might be clarity. For another, healing. For another, confirmation, reassurance, or hope. The message does not need to specify what is at stake because each listener supplies their own stakes. As a result, the urgency feels custom-fitted, even though it is structurally identical for everyone. This dynamic encourages compliance in subtle ways. Stay with me. Don't scroll away, hear me clearly. Or similar phrases function as behavioral cues that align the listener's actions with the heightened state of importance. These cues are often delivered calmly, even gently, which reduces resistance. The listener feels guided rather than commanded. However, the behavioral effect is the same: continued attention, reduced distraction, and increased receptivity. Over time, repeated exposure to this pattern can condition the listener's nervous system to associate spiritual or motivational language with heightened alertness. The body learns that when certain phrases appear, it must wake up, lean in, and prepare. Rest, neutrality, or casual listening begin to feel inappropriate in these contexts. This conditioning can make it difficult to engage with spiritual material in a relaxed, reflective way. Everything starts to feel urgent, heavy, and consequential, even when the content does not require that level of activation. Another important aspect of the carries weight framing is that it shields the message from later evaluation. If the content turns out to be vague, repetitive, or ungrounded, the listener may still feel that something important happened simply because of how it was framed. Emotional intensity can be mistaken for insight. A heightened state can be misread as transformation. The listener may leave with a strong feeling, but little concrete understanding, and yet interpret that feeling as evidence that the message was profound. This reinforces the authority of the framing itself rather than the substance of what was said. In this way, weight becomes self-validating. The message feels important because it was experienced in an activated state, and the activated state was induced by being told it was important. The loop closes neatly. It is also worth noting that this form of urgency exploits a common human vulnerability: the fear of missing something essential about oneself. When messages are framed as personally significant and time-sensitive, they tap into anxieties about being behind, unprepared, or out of alignment. For listeners who already feel uncertain or delayed in life, the implication that something crucial is happening now can be both comforting and stressful. Comforting because it suggests progress and movement. Stressful because it suggests that attention must be perfectly maintained to receive what is offered. The listener may feel pressured to stay emotionally open, spiritually receptive, and cognitively engaged, even if they are tired. Fatigue is overridden by importance. This contributes to spiritual or emotional exhaustion over time. Importantly, none of this requires malicious intent on the part of the speaker. These techniques are effective precisely because they align with natural cognitive and physiological responses. Humans are wired to pay attention to importance, to lean in when something is framed as consequential, and to avoid missing opportunities that feel rare or timely. The issue is not that urgency exists, but that it is decoupled from specificity, proportion, and grounding. When urgency is constantly invoked without clear resolution, the nervous system is repeatedly activated without being allowed to settle. This creates a chronic low-level stress that can masquerade as spiritual engagement. The listener may feel alive, alert, and involved, but also restless, tired, and unable to rest deeply. Over time, this pattern can erode the ability to discern what actually requires urgency and what does not. Everything begins to feel heavy. Everything begins to matter in the same inflated way. This analysis does not argue that messages should be bland, detached, or emotionally flat. Meaningful communication often does carry emotional weight. The key distinction is whether that weight emerges from clarity, coherence, and relevance, or whether it is asserted in advance to secure attention. When weight is declared rather than demonstrated, it shifts responsibility onto the listener to justify the feeling. If they feel something, the message must have been important. If they do not, they may assume they missed something internally. This subtly undermines self-trust. By examining how the claim of weight functions, the listener is given back a choice. They can notice the activation without immediately surrendering to it. They can remain present without assuming that presence requires compliance. They can allow importance to emerge if it does, rather than accepting it on command. In doing so, attention becomes a choice again, not an obligation, and engagement becomes grounded rather than driven by fear of missing something undefined but supposedly significant. The repeated contrast between the listener's current self and a promised future self, described as unrecognizable, functions as a powerful motivational and regulatory device by destabilizing present identity while suspending relief in an imagined later state. By framing the current self as temporary, unfinished, or misaligned with destiny, the message subtly introduces dissatisfaction with who the listener is now, even as it offers reassurance that this dissatisfaction is meaningful. Pain, doubt, exhaustion, confusion, and ambivalence are not treated as signals that something in the listener's environment, workload, relationships, or nervous system may need care or adjustment. Instead, they are reframed as markers of transition, proof that a transformation is underway. This reframing converts distress from something that might warrant practical support, rest, skill building, or external help into evidence of spiritual progress. The listener is taught to tolerate discomfort not because it can be resolved, but because it supposedly indicates proximity to a breakthrough. The promised future self becomes a psychological escape hatch. Relief is always coming, but never now. This structure keeps the listener oriented forward, waiting, enduring, and postponing self-compassion. The future self is depicted as whole, powerful, confident, and resolved, while the present self is implicitly deficient, fragmented, or obscured. As a result, the listener's current needs risk being minimized or ignored because attending to them could feel like interfering with the unfolding transformation. The language of becoming positions identity as provisional, suggesting that the listener should not fully inhabit or trust their present perceptions, boundaries, or desires. Instead, they are encouraged to hold themselves in suspension until the promised unveiling occurs. This creates a subtle dependency on the message itself, which claims to interpret the meaning of suffering and to forecast the moment of resolution. By defining pain as evidence of becoming, rather than as a condition deserving care, the message discourages grounded interventions such as therapy, rest, skill acquisition, relational repair, or changes in circumstance. Suffering is spiritualized rather than contextualized. The listener may begin to question their own instincts for relief, interpreting the desire for stability, ease, or ordinary satisfaction as premature or even regressive. Over time, this can erode trust in the present self and strengthen attachment to an abstract future identity that never fully arrives because its function is not fulfillment, but motivation. The contrast between current and future selves also narrows the listener's sense of acceptable experience. Neutrality, contentment, or simple functioning may feel insufficient or suspect because they lack the drama associated with transformation narratives. Ordinary growth, which often occurs incrementally, quietly, and without spectacle, is overshadowed by the promise of a sudden total metamorphosis. This can produce chronic self-monitoring. The listener scans their emotions for signs of becoming, interpreting distress as confirmation and calm as stagnation. In this way, the message reshapes the listener's relationship to their inner life, teaching them to endure rather than to respond, to wait rather than to act, and to interpret suffering symbolically rather than pragmatically. While the framing can initially feel relieving because it offers meaning and direction, it carries a cost. The present self is never allowed to be enough. Identity is always deferred. Pain is tolerated rather than addressed. Support is spiritualized rather than sought. The promised future self functions less as a destination than as a mechanism for keeping the listener engaged, compliant, and emotionally invested, while their current reality remains unresolved. The continuation of this analysis focuses on how the promise of a radically transformed future self functions as a regulatory mechanism rather than a supportive one. By repeatedly suggesting that the listener will soon be unrecognizable, the message implicitly devalues the present self-positioning it as merely a temporary container for something greater that has not yet arrived. This framing subtly teaches dissatisfaction. Ordinary emotions, fatigue, doubt, ambivalence, boredom, longing, are not treated as signals about needs, limits, or context, but as signs of imminent transformation. The listener is encouraged to endure rather than respond. Pain is not something to be understood or relieved. It is something to be tolerated because it allegedly proves progress. Over time, this creates a split between lived experience and meaning-making. The body may be signaling overload, grief, or depletion, while the narrative insists that these sensations are evidence of elevation. This mismatch can lead to chronic self-distrust, where the listener learns to override their own signals in favor of the promised future identity. The future self becomes a form of psychological credit. Relief is always deferred, never accessed in the present. The listener is not allowed to arrive, only to approach. This keeps engagement high, but resolution low. The structure also discourages practical intervention. If confusion is reframed as awakening, there is little incentive to seek clarification. If exhaustion is reframed as refinement, rest feels like betrayal. If isolation is reframed as being set apart, connection feels unnecessary or even dangerous. The message does not explicitly forbid support therapy, rest, or skill building, but it renders them irrelevant by assigning all distress a single totalizing explanation. This is efficient, but costly. Human experience is multi-determined. Collapsing it into one spiritual narrative reduces complexity at the expense of accuracy. Another mechanism at play is the subtle moralization of endurance. The listener who continues to struggle is told implicitly that this struggle is meaningful because it is leading somewhere extraordinary. Letting go of the narrative can then feel like wasting suffering, as if the pain must be justified retroactively. This creates an emotional sunk cost effect. The more one has endured under this framework, the harder it becomes to question it. To step away would mean admitting that the pain did not have the promised cosmic purpose, which can feel unbearable. The message also creates a temporal bind. The future self is always close, but never present. Language like soon, this season, or you're stepping into, maintains anticipation without delivering closure. Anticipation itself becomes the emotional reward. The nervous system remains in a state of readiness, scanning for signs that the transformation is arriving. This prolonged activation can feel like hope, but physiologically, it resembles chronic stress. Over time, the listener may experience anxiety, irritability, sleep disruption, or difficulty enjoying neutral moments, not because something is wrong with them, but because their system has been trained to expect significance at all times. Neutrality begins to feel like stagnation. Rest feels like falling behind. Ordinary life feels insufficient. Importantly, this is not the result of individual weakness or gullibility. These messages are effective precisely because they align with real human vulnerabilities: the desire for meaning, the need to make sense of suffering, the wish to believe that hardship will be redeemed. The critique here is not that people respond to these messages, but that the messages quietly replace supportive interpretation with performative endurance. A more stabilizing approach would allow the present self to be sufficient, even while change unfolds. It would treat pain as information rather than proof, and transformation as something that can include rest, confusion, and ordinariness without needing to be dramatized. Growth that is sustainable often feels anticlimactic. It does not require the erasure of the current self, only increased capacity to inhabit it. By examining how the promised future self is used rhetorically, the listener can begin to reclaim permission to address present needs without waiting for permission from a narrative. Nothing needs to be completed, activated, or unveiled for care to be appropriate now. The present self is not an obstacle to becoming. It is the only place becoming can occur. By invoking figures such as Joseph, Paul, Peter, Gideon, and Jeremiah, the message performs a subtle but powerful transfer of authority. These figures carry immense symbolic weight within religious traditions. They are remembered not as ordinary people navigating historical circumstances, but as archetypes of divine selection, suffering with purpose, and eventual vindication. When their stories are introduced not as contextual narratives, but as mirrors for the listener's identity, something important shifts. The authority that originally belonged to a shared tradition, a text, or a community of interpretation is quietly relocated onto the listener's personal experience without the grounding structures that originally held those stories in place. The listener is no longer simply learning about Joseph's imprisonment or Jeremiah's reluctance. They are being invited to inhabit those roles. Their own hardship is elevated from situational difficulty into evidence of participation in an ancient, ongoing divine pattern. This feels affirming, but it also bypasses discernment. Historical, cultural, and theological distance collapses. The listener is not asked to reflect on differences between contexts, resources, or meanings. The parallel is assumed, not examined. This creates a sense of borrowed significance. The emotional gravity of sacred narratives is imported wholesale into the present moment, lending intensity and legitimacy to the listener's pain without requiring analysis of its actual causes. Once this identification is established, ordinary explanations for hardship begin to feel insufficient or even invalid. Fatigue is no longer fatigue, it is preparation. Social rejection is no longer a mismatch of environments or needs, it is proof of chosenness. Confusion is no longer a signal that more information or support is required, it is evidence of standing on holy ground. The listener's life is no longer allowed to be simply human, contextual, or contingent. It must mean something larger because it has been framed as part of a sacred lineage. This framing discourages curiosity about practical factors such as mental health, socioeconomic stress, relational dynamics, or developmental transitions. To explore those explanations can feel like a betrayal of the elevated identity that has been offered. The message does not explicitly forbid ordinary reasoning, but it renders it emotionally unsatisfying compared to the grandeur of divine parallel. Another effect of this borrowed authority is the insulation of the message itself from critique. If questioning the narrative feels equivalent to questioning scripture or divine intent, critical thinking becomes morally charged. Doubt is reframed as lack of faith or resistance to destiny. The listener is subtly positioned as someone who already knows the truth deep down because they are like these figures. This bypasses the slow, often uncomfortable process of interpretation that religious traditions historically required: study, debate, community discernment, and humility before ambiguity. Instead, meaning is delivered fully formed and personalized. The listener is not invited into a conversation, they are inducted into a role. There is also a psychological cost to identifying with figures whose stories are remembered primarily for extraordinary outcomes. Joseph rises to power. Paul becomes a foundational leader. Peter is restored and commissioned. Gideon defeats overwhelming odds. Jeremiah is vindicated by history. When these arcs are mapped onto a listener's life, an implicit promise is made: your suffering will culminate in visible significance. If that culmination does not arrive, the listener may conclude not that the framework was flawed, but that they themselves have failed, delayed, or misunderstood their role. The narrative becomes self-protecting. Any outcome can be absorbed into it, but at the cost of increasing pressure on the individual to endure without resolution. Additionally, these figures are often remembered without the full complexity of their lives. Their doubts, contradictions, and unresolved struggles are flattened into symbols of destiny. When listeners adopt these identities, they may feel compelled to suppress ambivalence, anger, or the desire for ordinary comfort because such feelings do not fit the heroic script. Suffering becomes something to be displayed internally as proof of alignment, rather than something to be addressed. This can lead to isolation, as sharing pain, for the purpose of support, feels less appropriate than silently bearing it as a sign of calling. The invocation of sacred figures also creates a hierarchy of experience. If one's life is framed as analogous to prophets and apostles, then those who do not resonate with this framing may appear less awake, less chosen, or less significant. This can quietly erode mutuality and empathy. Relationships become filtered through spiritual ranking rather than shared humanity. The listener may feel misunderstood not because others lack care, but because the narrative has made ordinariness feel incompatible with their identity. Importantly, none of this requires the listener to consciously believe they are literally equal to these figures. The effect operates at the level of emotional association and self-concept. Feeling like Joseph or like Jeremiah is enough to shift how hardship is interpreted and how options are evaluated. The message leverages familiar names to shortcut meaning-making, offering instant coherence at the expense of nuance. A more stabilizing use of these stories would treat them as texts to be wrestled with rather than identities to be adopted. Their value would lie in exploring how people navigated uncertainty, made mistakes, relied on others, and remained human within specific historical constraints. When sacred narratives are used as mirrors rather than maps, they can inspire without enclosing. When they are used as identity templates, they risk replacing lived judgment with borrowed destiny. Recognizing this mechanism allows the listener to appreciate the emotional power of these stories without surrendering interpretive authority. One can respect tradition, resonate with themes, and still allow hardship to be explained, addressed, and supported in ordinary human ways. Pain does not need to be prophetic to be real, and difficulty does not need to echo scripture to deserve care. By extending the narrative from borrowed biblical authority into the idea of a pre-written destiny or heavenly blueprint, the message completes the transfer of interpretive power away from the listener's present judgment and into an unseen, inaccessible source. When the listener is told that their life is a scroll sealed in heaven already decided before birth, ordinary choice is reframed as delayed recognition rather than active authorship. This framing feels comforting because it relieves uncertainty, but it also subtly disempowers discernment. If outcomes are already written, then questioning direction can feel like doubting God rather than evaluating circumstances. The listener is encouraged to reinterpret ambiguity, not as information feedback or limits, but as temporary blindness to a predetermined plan. This collapses complexity into inevitability. Difficulty is no longer something to be investigated or addressed. It is evidence that the story is unfolding correctly. When suffering is rebranded as confirmation of destiny, the possibility that something is misaligned, unsustainable, or harmful becomes harder to acknowledge without guilt. The listener may feel pressure to endure rather than adjust to spiritualized strain, rather than respond to it practically. Over time, this can produce a disconnect between bodily signals and narrative meaning, where exhaustion, anxiety, or confusion are overridden by the demand to trust the process. The rhetoric then introduces isolation as evidence of elevation. Withdrawal, loneliness, or lack of support are reframed as divine hiding or sacred preparation. This reframing protects the narrative from contradiction. If connection decreases, it is not because the message is narrowing the listener's world, but because they are being set apart. This discourages seeking ordinary relational repair or external perspective, since disagreement can be interpreted as lack of spiritual sight. The listener is subtly trained to prefer affirmation over dialogue and resonance over reciprocity. As the message continues, engagement requests are woven seamlessly into the spiritual arc. Liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing, or giving financially are not presented as optional support actions, but as spiritual declarations, covenants, or seeds. This transforms behavioral compliance into moral or metaphysical alignment. The listener is no longer simply consuming content, they are proving belief through action. Public comments, especially those naming location or identity, function as ritualized belonging. Visibility becomes evidence of faith, and silence can feel like disobedience or fear. This creates a feedback loop where engagement generates emotional reward, which reinforces belief, which increases engagement. Validation is no longer grounded in lived outcomes or inner clarity, but in perceived participation in a chosen collective. The more one complies, the more one feels included. The more included one feels, the harder it becomes to step back without experiencing loss of identity. Importantly, none of this requires explicit coercion. The structure itself does the work. Affirmation is conditional, but framed as blessing. Doubt is not attacked directly. It is bypassed by urgency, destiny language, and emotional resonance. Over time, the listener may internalize the idea that neutrality is not allowed. To pause, rest, or disengage feels like stepping out of alignment with something sacred. Ordinary human needs, sleep stability, modest goals, unremarkable days can begin to feel like spiritual regression rather than healthy regulation. The repeated insistence that the listener is rare, different, or chosen intensifies this effect. While initially empowering, it creates a binary where ordinariness becomes failure. If one is meant for extraordinary impact, then desiring a quiet life can feel like betrayal of purpose. This produces anxiety around rest and simplicity because these states do not mirror the promised narrative of constant becoming. Sustainable growth, by contrast, often feels anticlimactic. It is incremental, inconsistent, and deeply ordinary. It includes rest, boredom, repetition, and recalibration. It does not require an audience or constant self-redefinition. But such growth lacks the emotional intensity that the chosen one narrative supplies, making it harder to recognize as meaningful. The message also subtly discourages mutuality by framing boundaries through superiority rather than capacity. When others are described as unconscious low frequency or draining, relational limits are justified through metaphysical hierarchy instead of honest assessment of energy compatibility or timing. This prevents repair because it removes equality. Needing space becomes evidence of elevation rather than a neutral human need. Yet healthy boundaries do not require cosmic explanation. They arise from finite nervous systems, changing seasons, and contextual demands. When boundaries are moralized, they become rigid and isolating, cutting off the possibility of return. Throughout the message, identity is kept in a state of suspense. The listener is always on the verge of becoming never fully arrived. This maintains engagement because fulfillment is always imminent but never present. The future self remains undefined enough to absorb projection, while the present self is continually positioned as insufficient. Relief is promised, but resolution is deferred. This structure mirrors other high-arousal motivational systems where anticipation replaces integration. Instead of asking, "What do I need right now?" the listener is guided to ask, "Who am I becoming?" which is a more abstract and less answerable question. By the end, the listener may feel uplifted, seen, and energized, yet also subtly destabilized. Their sense of worth is tied to a narrative they did not author. Their discernment is outsourced to spiritual framing, and their belonging is maintained through compliance rather than mutual recognition. None of this negates the sincerity of belief or the comfort such messages can provide. It simply reveals the mechanics at work. Slowing down to notice these structures allows the listener to re-enter a relationship with their own experience as an authority. Meaning does not need to be cosmic to be real. Growth does not need to be dramatic to be true. And rest does not need justification to be allowed. Suffering, framed as strategic, operates by transforming distress from a signal into a symbol. Instead of pain indicating that something is wrong, unsustainable, or in need of care, it becomes proof that something is right, meaningful, and ordained. This shift is emotionally soothing in the short term because it protects the listener from the randomness and unfairness of hardship. Pain no longer feels arbitrary. It feels selected. Yet this same reframing quietly reverses the function of suffering in human experience. Ordinarily, pain prompts adjustment, rest, boundary setting, skill acquisition, environmental change, or support seeking. When pain is spiritualized as preparation, these adaptive responses can be reinterpreted as avoidance, weakness, or lack of faith. The listener may begin to mistrust their own nervous system, overriding signals of depletion with narratives of endurance. Relief becomes suspicious. Calm feels undeserved. Stability feels like stagnation. If one's identity has been constructed around surviving pressure, then the absence of pressure can feel like loss of purpose rather than gain of health. This creates a paradox where healing threatens identity. When struggle has been named as the evidence of chosenness, moving into a more regulated, ordinary state can feel like falling out of alignment with destiny. The listener may unconsciously maintain hardship through overwork, emotional suppression, relational isolation, or refusal of help, not because they desire pain, but because pain has been positioned as the path to meaning. The rhetoric rarely instructs listeners to seek relief. It instructs them to endure. Endurance is praised while resolution is postponed. This can lead to a chronic state of limbo, where the listener is always almost there, always being refined, always in process. Importantly, the message does not require the listener to actively choose suffering. It simply redefines suffering as noble, which is often enough to sustain it. When improvement does occur, it may be experienced with guilt or anxiety. Questions arise internally. Why am I okay when others are still struggling? Did I miss a lesson? Am I being complacent? Instead of relief integrating naturally, it must be justified spiritually or reframed as a temporary plateau before the next trial. In this way, suffering becomes self-perpetuating, not because pain is desirable, but because the narrative has attached moral and existential value to it. The listener's relationship to time is also altered. Difficulty is framed as temporary, but indefinite. It will end in due season soon, or at the appointed time without concrete markers. This vagueness prevents the listener from evaluating progress or making informed decisions about change. If there is no timeline, there is no threshold at which continued pain becomes unacceptable. Waiting becomes a virtue in itself. Agency is deferred in favor of patience, but patience without parameters can slide into passivity. The listener may stop asking practical questions. What is within my control? What would help right now? What patterns are repeating because the answer is always the same? Endure, trust, remain faithful. Over time, this can flatten the listener's emotional range. Anger, grief, and disappointment are permitted only insofar as they are immediately redeemed into testimony. There is little space for unresolved emotion, ambivalence, or mourning without a redemptive arc. Pain must mean something, therefore it cannot simply be felt and released. This increases internal pressure. The self is always being watched, interpreted, evaluated, not by others necessarily, but by the internalized narrative. The listener becomes both the sufferer and the narrator of suffering, constantly scanning experience for signs that it counts. This can erode self-trust. When distress arises, instead of responding compassionately, the listener may ask, "What is this preparing me for? Why was this assigned to me? What am I supposed to learn?" These questions can be meaningful, but when they replace questions of care and capacity, they delay relief. The body's needs are subordinated to the story's demands. Moreover, when suffering is framed as intentionally designed responsibility, subtly shifts. If pain is authored by a divine plan, then addressing structural, relational, or psychological causes can feel secondary or even irreverent. Seeking therapy, leaving harmful environments, or naming injustice may feel less spiritually valid than enduring quietly. This does not mean the message explicitly discourages help. Rather, it renders help less central than meaning. Meaning becomes the primary currency, and meaning is delivered by the narrative, not by outcomes. The listener may feel proud of their endurance even as their quality of life diminishes. Others may praise their faith while missing their fatigue. Because the message promises eventual vindication, present harm is tolerated longer than it would be otherwise. There is also a comparative effect. If suffering equals preparation, then those who appear comfortable may be interpreted as less chosen, less deep, or less awakened. This can distort empathy. Instead of seeing others' ease as neutral or hard-won, the listener may unconsciously rank experiences valuing intensity over stability. This reinforces the internal rule that ease is suspicious. The result is a subtle resistance to normalcy. Ordinary joys, routine work, predictable relationships, quiet evenings can feel spiritually thin compared to the drama of transformation narratives. Yet sustainable well-being is often built from exactly these unremarkable elements. It grows through repetition, safety, and gradual integration, not through constant rupture. When the listener has been trained to expect growth to feel like suffering, they may overlook growth that feels calm. They may miss the fact that regulation, not activation, is what allows capacity to expand. The message's insistence that suffering is necessary also complicates recovery from trauma. Trauma already teaches the nervous system that threat is normal and safety is unfamiliar. When spiritual language reinforces this by framing distress as purposeful, it can entrench hypervigilance. The listener may remain braced for the next trial, unable to settle even when conditions improve. Healing, which often involves relearning safety and trust, can feel spiritually unproductive because it lacks visible struggle. In this way, the narrative aligns unintentionally with trauma dynamics, valorizing endurance over repair. None of this requires malicious intent. The language of redemptive suffering has deep historical and theological roots, and it has offered genuine comfort to many. The risk emerges not from the existence of meaning, but from its exclusivity. When suffering is the primary pathway to worth, other pathways are diminished. Joy, competence, rest, curiosity, and connection become secondary or conditional. The listener's full humanity is narrowed to a single axis: endure now, be rewarded later. Slowing down to examine this framing allows for a more flexible relationship with pain. Suffering can have meaning without being mandatory. Growth can emerge from challenge without requiring perpetual distress. Relief does not negate depth. Stability does not erase story. When pain is allowed to be a signal again, not a test, not a badge, not a prerequisite, the listener regains the ability to respond rather than endure. This restores choice. It allows the listener to seek healing without fear of losing identity, to accept calm without suspicion, and to recognize that being human does not require being perpetually forged in fire. Periods of silence, isolation, and stalled momentum are reframed in this messaging as intentional divine concealment, rather than as neutral, contextual, or solvable realities. Silence is not treated as absence, ambiguity, or lack of information. It is elevated into evidence of hidden activity. Isolation is not examined as a social condition, a life phase, burnout, depression, or a mismatch of environment. It is reframed as sacred separation. Lack of progress is not evaluated as a signal to adjust strategy, seek feedback, build skills, or rest. It is interpreted as incubation. This reframing is emotionally effective because it rescues the listener from the discomfort of not knowing why nothing is working. Instead of confronting uncertainty, the listener is offered certainty something important is happening, just not where you can see it. This preserves hope without requiring evidence. However, it also subtly removes the listener's ability to assess reality. When silence is always meaningful and delay is always purposeful, there is no neutral data left to interpret. Everything confirms the narrative. If things move forward, it proves the preparation worked. If nothing changes, it proves the work is hidden. In both cases, the framework remains intact. This creates a closed interpretive loop in which external circumstances no longer inform decision-making. The listener is encouraged to wait rather than inquire, to endure rather than experiment. Questions like, is this environment supportive? Do I need new skills? Is this relationship reciprocal? Or am I depleted? Are quietly displaced by a single explanation. Concealment precedes revelation. This framing reduces the perceived legitimacy of doubt. If one questions the situation, one risks being labeled impatient, unfaithful, or spiritually immature. Curiosity becomes suspect. Evaluation becomes interference. Seeking feedback from others may feel unnecessary or even dangerous because the narrative implies that outsiders cannot see what is being formed. This isolates the listener further, not only socially but cognitively. Their internal model of reality becomes self-referential. Progress is no longer measured by learning, connection, or tangible change, but by the ability to tolerate waiting. Waiting itself becomes the metric of growth. The longer nothing happens, the more special the eventual unveiling is imagined to be. This can make it psychologically difficult to exit unproductive situations. A job that provides no growth, a creative path that yields no feedback, or a relational dynamic that remains one-sided can all be endured far longer than is healthy, because leaving would feel like abandoning a divine process. The listener may override practical dissatisfaction by telling themselves that discomfort is proof of depth. Silence is romanticized. Lack of recognition is sanctified. Obscurity is framed as protection. While there are moments in life where quiet integration is genuinely necessary, this framework removes the ability to distinguish between restorative stillness and stagnation. Both are given the same meaning. This discourages adaptive change. Strategy adjustment is replaced with patience. Skill development is replaced with trust. Structural barriers are replaced with destiny language. Over time, the listener may experience a growing gap between inner expectation and outer reality, because the promised unveiling remains vague and deferred hope is sustained without resolution. This creates chronic anticipation. The nervous system remains in a holding pattern, neither fully mobilizing nor fully resting. Energy is conserved for a future moment that never quite arrives. This can lead to fatigue, demoralization, and self-doubt, which are then reabsorbed into the narrative as further evidence of refinement. The listener is told that the pressure is necessary, that the wait means something valuable is being formed. This interpretation reduces the likelihood that the listener will ask whether the pressure is simply too much. Silence also functions as a protection against falsification. If nothing observable is happening, the claim cannot be disproven. Invisible work cannot be measured. Hidden preparation cannot be audited. This places the listener in a position of perpetual trust without feedback. Human learning, however, typically requires feedback. Growth accelerates when actions are tested, errors are corrected, and information is exchanged. By discouraging engagement with external input, the narrative slows learning while preserving belief. The listener may feel faithful while remaining stuck. Isolation is particularly potent in this framework. Being alone is framed as being chosen away from others. This can initially soothe feelings of rejection or social mismatch by recoding them as intentional selection. Instead of asking why connections feel difficult or what skills might help, the listener is told they are simply not meant to mix yet. This explanation relieves shame, but also delays relational repair. Loneliness becomes meaningful rather than actionable. The listener may withdraw further, believing that connection will come later after the unveiling. In the meantime, social muscles atrophy, confidence erodes, re-entry becomes harder. The longer one stays isolated, the more threatening reconnection can feel, reinforcing the cycle. Silence from life, from others, or from God is also framed as a test. The listener is encouraged to remain loyal without reassurance. While endurance can be valuable, prolonged uncertainty without feedback is psychologically taxing. Humans regulate through signals. When signals are absent, anxiety increases. By instructing the listener to reinterpret anxiety as proof of faithfulness, the message normalizes distress while postponing relief. The listener may feel proud of their endurance while quietly becoming dysregulated. There is also a subtle transfer of responsibility. If nothing is happening, it is not because the approach is ineffective or the conditions are wrong. It is because the timing is not yet right. Agency is deferred to an unseen plan. This can feel comforting, but it also reduces the listener's sense of influence. Over time, this can lead to passivity masked as trust. The listener waits for permission rather than creating options. They may fear that taking initiative could disrupt the hidden process. This is especially impactful for people already prone to self-doubt or learned helplessness. The narrative validates inaction as virtue. Importantly, the framework rarely provides criteria for when concealment ends and evaluation begins. There is no point at which the listener is encouraged to reassess. The instruction is simply to hold on. This can trap the listener in extended liminality, always preparing, never arriving. While some life phases genuinely require waiting, growth also requires movement. Without the ability to distinguish between the two, the listener risks confusing endurance with wisdom. Slowing down to examine this reframing restores nuance. Silence can mean rest, but it can also mean disconnection. Isolation can be protective, but it can also be a sign of unmet needs. Lack of progress can indicate incubation, but it can also indicate misalignment. Allowing these possibilities does not negate faith or meaning. It reintroduces discernment. It gives the listener permission to ask practical questions without interpreting them as spiritual failure. It returns authority to lived experience. When silence is allowed to be ambiguous rather than automatically meaningful, the listener can respond flexibly. They can rest when rest is needed, seek feedback when learning is needed, and change direction when stagnation is evident. Hope becomes grounded rather than deferred. Progress becomes something that can be participated in rather than awaited.